Hello and welcome to another Note to File podcast, a collection of interviews, best practices, and candid conversation for clinical research sites. I'm your host, Brad Hightower. Our guest this week is Wayne Walker. Wayne is Senior Vice President of Product for Rave Platform Technology, which includes Rave EDC, Rave RTSM, Rave Imaging, Rave Coder, and Rave Safety Gateway at Medidata Solutions. His responsibilities include strategy, development, and delivery of these products across all research and development disciplines. Before joining Medidata, Wayne spent 12 years overseeing product management for clinical technology used by Data Management and Biometrics at PRA Health Sciences. This involved oversight of platform as a service, software as a service, on-premise deployed environments, and in-house developed solutions. This week, we discuss vendor-site relationships, why there's been such a proliferation of disparate systems, the potential of direct EDC data entry, and so much more. Really fun conversation. So without further ado, Wayne Walker. All right, we welcome to the show this week, Wayne Walker. Wayne, how's it going?
Good, thanks, Brad.
Where are you coming to us from today?
So I live just outside Kansas City, a town called Lenexa, Kansas, home of the Chiefs to the Super Bowl win. So coming off the sort of euphoria of that a little bit. Lived here for 30 years, actually originally from Wales. And there's a long story around how I got here that I probably shouldn't bore people with.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if that was a Kansas City accent you had or not. But yeah, anyone listening, we're recording this the morning after the Super Bowl. So I grew up in Northeast Oklahoma, pretty close to Kansas City, closest NFL team anyway. So I think we're both happy with the outcome of last night's game.
Absolutely. And the last time that the Chiefs did win the Super Bowl, I was in the UK. So I was wondering if me being in Kansas City was going to have a little bad luck last night, but luckily it didn't.
No, I mean, yeah, sounds like, brought the luck with you. So
yeah,
appreciate that. Well, I'd like to start out the show just like I do with all my guests. I'm always kind of curious to hear people's backgrounds and sort of how they got into the clinical trial space. I mean, it's always, not always, but, there's a lot of twists and turns and people getting in by accident. And it's always just kind of instructive to hear, people's backgrounds. So if you would, tell us a little bit about your, clinical research backstory.
Yeah, I think it's like a lot of people, you don't necessarily have a target of getting into clinical research, but then once you land in it, it gets in your blood. And I'm no different, to be honest. I was a SAS programmer at Sallie Mae, servicing student loans, dating myself a little bit because we were on a mainframe. And a recruiter reached out looking for a SAS programmer at PRA Health Sciences. I think it was just Pharmaceutical Research Associates at the time. They went through a couple of name changes. And I was a clinical programmer. And if you'd asked me what that was when I took the job, I would not have had any clue. But basically, back then, a clinical programmer, paper days, was very much responsible for sort of setting up the database, the clinical database in a system. We had one at PRA, but also, unlike maybe today, where it's becomes very specialized through the clinical trial process, a clinical programmer back then not only did the database, they wrote the edit checks, they did the reports, they did the data reconciliation, they did the data transformation to a sponsor standard, and that was my entry. I then sort of meandered a little bit at PRA for a few years, doing some system administration, even was an Oracle DBA for a short period of time because one of the DBAs we had quit. And then I got into product management at PRA. Product management back then in a CRO is a little different in that it sort of broached not only in-house developed solutions, but also, which is traditional product management, but also the utilization of vendors. So I was exposed to the gamut of sort of clinical technology across all of the sort of biometric data management groups at PRA. And I loved that job. It was the people I worked with were phenomenal. You did something different every single day, worked with a lot of great people in technology, as well as a lot of customers. Obviously, the primary technology that we were using at the time was EDC across 3 or 4 different partners at that time, but also the other types of technology that were coming on the market. At that point, I was at PRA for 18 years, loved every minute of it, but wanted to do something different. And Medidata called. They had an open position for basically the head of product management for Rave. And I joined about 6 years ago, had various different products under my umbrella over that time. Today, I have sort of 6 products, the major ones being EDC, Rave. I also have the randomization and trial supply management capabilities that we have here at Medidata. Imaging is under my umbrella also. Coder, the medical coding tool that we have, as well as Safety Gateway, which is basically an integration fabric from EDC into safety systems, so that get away from the fax process that a lot of people have had around SAE reporting.
Yeah, it is wild. There's still so much utilization of a fax machine. Something yes. I guess I didn't think too much about when I started trying to run sites is I got to have fax machines still sitting in our offices. So
it's still prevalent. It really is.
Yeah, again, it blows me away, but it is what it is. So yeah, no, interesting roles. I'm always curious, and I know Medidata's done a at least seemingly good job of interacting with sites and sort of getting feedback. And I guess I'm curious what your a role is not just like the one you have in Medidata, but even through PRA. Is there a lot of or any real contact with sites in any way? Considering, what you do is presumably well connected to what's happening at sites, but even for us, it's like we have no idea what's going on behind the scenes in many ways. And it's always kind of interesting to me to meet people like you and other data management type of roles. And you're like, oh, there's like it's a bunch of people in the background doing stuff and we don't even know about it. Do they know about us? Like, what it seems like it would be good for everyone with a little bit more interaction or familiarity with what's going on both sides.
Yeah, at Medidata, it really is a little more proactive than it was when I was at PRA. Back in the day when we'd all get together an investigator meeting at the kickoff of the trial, obviously we got a lot of exposure to sites, and it was great speaking to the sort of investigators and the coordinators at those events and the challenges that they had. But obviously we were using vendors, so we were a little, we weren't really in control of that site experience necessarily because as CRO, the sponsor tells us what technology, but it was still good to get that feedback maybe on sort of eCRF design. In my current role, it's a little more formalized. We have a number of little avenues to get site input and feedback. One is Medidata works with SCRS, and we have a site advisory group, which is about 16 people. And when we look at the makeup of that, what I try to do, input and participation across a wide variety of sort of site personnel and locations. So SCRS gave us a big long list of people, and then you choose. And we made sure that we had sort of geographic coverage, as well as Brad, there's different types of sites. Some are in a massive hospital complex. Some are in smaller, even one-off type of sites. And that's the needs of those different types of sites is different, and the experience is different. So we made sure that we had participation from all of those different shapes, so to speak, of sites. And then another tool that we use outside of like the informal sort of conference input, which, is a little hit or miss, is we use in our platform, we have something called Pendo, which actually can, spit out surveys to sites, get feedback from sites, point them to videos. So we have a group that manages that, and we use that quite often to get that input.
Nice. Yeah. I love the idea, of these, site advisory councils, or, oftentimes called different things. I guess just out of curiosity, is there anything you hear from those that you find particularly like surprising, or maybe even just commonly heard issues from the site side? I mean, I know that, you know, in credit to you guys, I mean, look, whenever I get a new study, I'm at a point now where I'm just like, please just be Rave, just use Rave as the EDC. Why are we bothering with some of these other EDCs? But certainly there's still, some feedback you must be hearing from sites that's maybe fairly consistent.
Yeah, a couple of things that actually come to mind that we learned from those engagements. One was a little funny story was, and we may get to it later on, but we are releasing a product that basically is a little tool set for sites to, rather than manually type from their system into Rave, they can point and click to the data that needs to go into the ECRF. And we engaged with a couple of users from we had a broad sort of communication to our site advisory group, but then we wanted to get real specific feedback from a couple of those members, ones that we knew they'd be sort of blatant and open and forthright and direct in their feedback, right? We all deal with those types of people, and they're wonderful for us. We prefer that direct feedback, uninhibited, so to speak. And we went through the demo, and this lady was like, this is great. This is wonderful. And then it came to the end, and I asked, so if we put this in your tool set tomorrow, would you use it? And she said, yeah, I'd love to, but we still collect data on paper. And that was a little surprising. And then I'm actually participating in a clinical trial right now. I sort of jumped in this year into a trial at my cardiologist and just had a visit this morning, and they collected everything on paper. And by the way, that's not a small site. They're running like 12 trials. I spoke to the lady there. So the paper piece of clinical trial data collection at the site is a little surprising. The complaints that I get from sites in those forums that I just mentioned earlier are very much around, and this is not news to any of the sites listening to this, is just the number of systems they have to use. I won't give the lady's name at the office that I was at this morning, but she really does, and you hear about this, but she really does have a book where she keeps all of the logins that she has for the 12 clinical trials that she is on at this time. So that's a common complaint. The other complaint that we often get, and again, site people this is not going to be sort of foreign to them, is the number of duplicate queries that they get from whoever's managing the data, because they get them from clinical operations faction as well as the data management groups. So that's, and they're answering the same question over and over and doesn't update the data. And then the other one that really comes to mind is the complexity of the ECRFs, interact with. Some are very simple, and some they actually don't know what's going on with that ECRF. So those are, say, the brush strokes of what their complaints are and what their problems are.
Yeah, I mean, obviously those certainly resonate with me, and surely a lot of the site level folks that are listening. So, I mean, some of those are really interesting though, and I do want to drill down on a few if we can. I mean, I think something that has always jumped out to me, I mean, and it's sort of just become, I feel like it's just noise in the wind now, but yes, the number of systems, but I'm still have a hard time wrapping my head around why that's the case, especially, you rifled off a few different systems that, you're over, or products, or however you classify them. And like for us at the site level, it's not always clear like why you've got access. Like if you're using Rave, why wouldn't you use the rest of these systems as a sponsor or CRO, I guess? I mean, is there a good reason for that? Is it why there's like apprehension? I hear things like best in breed, and I hear things like that there's so many different not competing, but siloed departments making these decisions sort of independently of one another. And oftentimes maybe one group doesn't know what the other one's even doing. Like, is there a reason this is so pervasive?
Well, that's really, you just hit the nail on the head, Brad, is that there are some organizations that look at the platform perspective and try and make that as simple as possible. They may not use everything on a certain provider, but they'll use maybe the major ones and then have sort of specific best of breed ones that maybe specialize in one therapeutic area or reasons like that. But the vast majority of the time is that these organizations are making decisions on the technology that they use very much in a silo. And there may not be sort of a conductor, an orchestra leader that is saying, well, look, yeah, that's what we want to use, but let's look at the site's experience in this because it's not very pleasant. So that's the majority of the reason, or the major reason why that's the case. The thing that I think a lot of organizations that do that best of breed type of decision making lose sight of is it's not only a bad experience for sites, right? That's a no-brainer. But they also sort of lose operational efficiency when, they're trying to gather all that data, or they're managing a protocol amendment that actually spans 2 or 3 technologies, and now someone's got to coordinate the rollout of those things. So there's multiple reasons why that is, and there's multiple sort of consequences, not all good, of that type of approach. And the reality is that most of the technologies around those sort of different, whether it be randomization, trial supply, electronic patient-reported outcomes, imaging, most of the organizations that have, all of those facets of data acquisition and patient engagement, they have a good enough type of technology that it's not going to impact the trial if you go with a provider that covers more than just one of those technology areas. The other reason I think that organizations also sort of pick and choose across those different providers is they don't want all their eggs in one basket, so to speak. So they try and manage risk of, maybe having a problem with one vendor that offers all those, because then if they don't perform very well, then now, all of the technology elements are having problems. So I think those are the sort of 3 reasons I'd say why there's such a widespread technology landscape when you conduct a clinical trial.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think, again, it's frustrating at a site level to see like, okay, well, you're using Rave, great. Well, then you're using 4 other systems across other whole other different platforms that were there within. And
Yeah.
I get, I guess I shouldn't be shocked knowing that, because I've heard also you bring up the idea of like risk mitigation in some way, that we go so far out of our our way to like protect ourselves, but it makes everything so much more complicated.
Yeah.
And again, I know there must be like a cost benefit analysis somewhere that says like that must be, I guess, preferable to actually having everything in one, easy to access place, but it just still seems a little bit insane to me.
Yeah, I think that the problem is that I'm sure multiple people have put that cost benefit analysis, but the people that are actually making the decisions may not be privy or sometimes even care about that, because they think that they need to go with that vendor because we've used them before. They specialize. We've got a relationship with them, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Again, I'm sure it's complex and the reasons are many, but nonetheless, it's a constant, just frustrating to see when I'm like, man, come on. We got it all right here. What are you doing? Why are you doing this to us?
Yeah. And look, we've had industry initiatives that have tried to solve this problem. Obviously, SIP from Transcelerate went into that. And we all know that the prevalence of that and the obstacles to use that have made it, I'm not going to use the word fail, but not get the consequences and the benefits that we all thought conceptually.
Yeah, I don't think it's lived up to the a promise, I guess. I mean, again, conceptually, it's a great idea, but practically using it, it just leaves a lot to be desired. Let's say I've done plenty of SIP bashing in my days. I'm not trying to put them down. Again, I think the idea is, brilliant idea, but it's complicated too. I mean, I've got to give them some grace there. It's not as easy to do and make everyone happy, because as you alluded to earlier too, sites are different in so many ways. And if I were a single site with a PI and a sub-I, probably be great, be easy. It'd be a lot simpler than, trying to run multiple locations with rotating staff and all these different things that it just doesn't account well for. But again, how can you appeal to so many variations in site models? It's complex.
Well, and the other element of that, and there are organizations that, really are invested in a good site experience. And one of the technologies that they use is sort of a single sign-on. So you'll go in through that sponsor's sort of portal, so to speak, and then you'll have a link to Rave and a link to whatever other technology. And they manage the sort of authentication of that user. And then you can, click on the link and you get into that technology, and the authorization is what you have access to is managed by that technology provider. But the site that I visited this morning, they're doing studies for, I think it was 4 different sponsors. So if one of those has, a portal or some type of central login that they can use, the other 3 don't. So it's really not, it makes it a little easier, but it's not making their life easy. The other example that comes to mind is the lady at this site, when she found out what I did, she said, "Oh, let me go get my laptop. I got a load of questions for you around Rave." And I sat there for like an hour. This was at the pre-screening or screening visit that I had. And she loved e-consent, right? Loved it. She said, "Yeah, I'm doing e-consent on these studies. I got all these other studies. Why aren't I using e-consent on those?" And I had to explain, that's not a decision that we make. That's a decision that the sponsor makes. So yeah, it's got to be confusing for the sites as to why some of these decisions are made, for sure.
Well, yeah, and even to that point, 2 points there. I mean, one, I've got studies with the same sponsor where they're using different systems. So you're not even promised consistency if you're working with the same sponsor and CRO. That can be frustrating. But then to your point, and something I've always kind of wondered about, let's say, and I'll try to keep it somewhat generic, but if you're a vendor or a software company, even if you have a great product, to what degree are you sort of hamstrung by the requests of your clients, right? So maybe your EDC is amazing, but sponsors are making requests that make it unclear, complex, challenging for sites. I mean, that has to be a challenging situation. And I think that's something, if you've had a site, if you don't know that's happening, certainly you've had the suspicion where you're like, well, wait a minute, I've used this before and it was great. And this time I'm using it and it's terrible. I mean, does that put, vendors in a tough spot? I mean, obviously they need to win business and do, they're going to do what their customers want them to do, but it can also really ruin the experience for other stakeholders.
I'm actually just going through an example of that with a sponsor right now that I won't give the situation because they'll know who they are. And,
of course,
but those requests come in quite frequently, and it places a burden on the site. And we usually stick to our ground if it's just, way off the charts on the request. And that this one specific one, we are going to stick to our ground because I think it would be a nightmare for sites around asking for some other query information that I'm just not going to do. And I've told the sponsor that. On the ones that they're adamant and we sort of try and pump the brakes around, have you really thought about what this means to your main users of the system? Because in a clinical trial, in our technology, the vast majority of the users on a trial are site users. So, you've got to think about this from a macro level of what that means to the majority of the individuals that are actually executing your study. But if it's absolutely, so we advise that's probably not a good idea. But if they're absolutely adamant and there's some gray area there, we'll make sure that it's configurable. So we won't mandate it so they can actually turn it on or off at a sponsor level. But it's still an awkward conversation with the site, right? Because they think that's our choice.
Right.
And we're happy to have those conversations, but it can be, as I say, go back to the e-consent example, it can be confusing to the site users as to why certain decisions are made. And all our sponsors, I think their heart is in the right place. I know their heart is in the right place.
Sure.
But sometimes they probably need to sort of experience it from the site perspective. When I was at PRA in my early days of EDC implementation, so about '08, I went out to about 3 or 4 site visits with some CRAs, which was very enlightening. I think that maybe some of our sort of stakeholders in the clinical technology space would benefit from that, and just sitting down with sites for an hour or two and seeing what the day in the life is like.
Yeah, I think in fairness, I mean, I've seen more of that over the last year or so from especially newer sort of software vendors that are coming out, because I don't think they just don't have that. I mean, Rave and the EDC like for a while, but you got new companies coming out. They don't really know, what happens at a site, which, fair enough. So they are coming out and seeing. So I think that is encouraging in a lot of ways. And I don't know, it'd be really cool to have sites look over the design before, like just so they can, because again, I think you could solve a lot of problems up front by being like, wait, this is weird. Don't do this. But, I'm with you. I do. Certainly sponsors have good intentions, right? But there's just a disconnect all across the industry, and not just in this case, but, nobody seems to really, be able to put those pieces together sometimes.
Yeah, one thing I forgot to mention earlier, Brad, when you asked around, how do we get input from sites? One thing that I'm kicking off this year, and it's actually, again, from my engagement, just sprung to mind, engagement with the site that I'm on this clinical trial. And the conversation that I had when the lady went and got her laptop, and I spent an hour with answering questions and showing her different things in Rave, was we have user groups. All the technology providers, or the vast majority of them, have sort of user groups, user meetings. And it's very much tailored to sort of sponsors, CROs, data managers, clinical operations, project managers. But, trying to get sites to have 2 days away from their sites in the middle of the week that's not going to happen. Yeah. So I'm working with our sort of events team, a fairly low weight type of engagement with sites, in that we'll come around to different locations across the country and just have sort of informal gatherings, get some appetizers, go over some stuff on our products maybe, and then just give them a forum to ask questions. And I think that's, I'm hoping that's going to be successful, because I think there are sort of concentrations across the country that have a lot of sort of clinical research going on. And if we can just have those little social gatherings in the evening, they'll feel better connected and get some of these questions answered. And we all know that the clinical research space is fairly tight-knit. I was speaking to the lady at the site, and she said, I know so-and-so that's in some other organization that's doing, either on the same study or maybe other studies, and they know each other. Even if it's like word of mouth stuff coming out of those types of engagements, I think that would be beneficial.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I do think a lot of sites want to be, they want to be involved to help make things better, but don't really have a good outlet for it. I mean, I'll keep complaining on LinkedIn, but not everyone is out there letting their voices sort of be heard and being able to be involved in a meaningful way. So I think that is cool to be able to at least hear them out, And even me, I still see patients, but I'm less connected than, your quote unquote common coordinator who deals with more of these problems on a day-to-day basis. So there's levels to it, Again, like you said, unfortunately, the sort of person most impacted is the least able to speak up about it because they're busy. They're seeing patients all day. We got to keep generating revenue at the site or we're, screwed. So it's an interesting conundrum, but I do appreciate that, at least you're putting some thought into it. That goes a long ways.
And I'd welcome anybody that is a metadata user for any of our capabilities on the platform. There's feedback mechanisms within the platform. Feel free to use them. I know that you're sort of, 100 miles an hour, got to get stuff done. But if you have like 2 minutes, just hit the feedback button and send something through. Don't think that those go into a black hole. They may not be actioned right away, but we do look at that stuff because that's the most direct feedback that we can possibly get. It's in that moment when you're trying to do something. Please feel free to give that feedback.
I like that. There's one other point that jumped out to me. Well, there were a few, but there's one at least I definitely want to hit on. And that's, again, something I relate to too strongly. But, the use of sites still using paper for their source documentation, right? And that's probably way more prevalent than people imagine. And, we might be running anywhere from 20 to 50 trials at a time, and we use all paper. And, I had a conversation with, Raymond at Creo recently about, eSource and EDC and EHR and the sort of connection or lack of between the three. I've always wondered, why Rave doesn't have an eSource, a more eSource facing platform. Is that something you guys have ever considered at some point? Because frankly, I don't care what's happening in the background, right? And I feel like EDC is just a way to get data to people who need the data, right? But site-facing, obviously we're using paper as it stands, but why couldn't there be a site-facing direct data entry method? And the FDA seems to be on board with that. And if you look at their guidance from 10 years ago, why haven't we seen any movement in that direction? Is that outlandish or is that feasible?
I think there are reasons why maybe that envelope hasn't been pushed so much over the last 10 years. But what has kicked maybe a renewed focus of that off is obviously the decentralized nature of how we're conducting clinical trials now. So, and people on the podcast here may think this is a plan, but it absolutely is not. But we are looking into getting into that space, in that creating a Rave app that basically has two use cases. One is the ability for a home health nurse to go out to the patient's site, so they don't have to, the patient's home, so that patient doesn't need to come into the site, and you can actually enter that data directly into Rave. And the app allows us to control the workflow and the user experience better than just putting it in a browser. But the other use case there, and it's been a common ask from our phase 1 sites, but can be used across the gamut, is the ability to capture the data directly at bedside. And the phase 1 space is ideal because they are seeing maybe 6, 7, 8 patients at a time, and they go from one patient to the other, collecting certain data. So that the plan is, again, this is sort of forward-looking statements, I know, but the plan is sometime this year to get that into the market, to allow sites to do the bedside data capture as well as the home health nurse type of use. And the benefit operationally for the other stakeholders outside of the sites is that we can actually determine what type of review is done on that data. So there's an operational benefit as well as a site-facing benefit, because if it is eSource, then you shouldn't query that data as much as you should transcribed data.
Yeah, you've got the data. That's it. That is the source, right? So at that point, there's no additional source data verification. I would think that it would potentially, I don't want to say solve a lot of problems, but address a lot of issues, that exist that make the process so much more costly and time consuming. Again, it seems like a win-win. And to your point, we did not set up this question beforehand. This was actually a spontaneous question. So it's interesting. I did not know you guys had something worked up like that. It just makes so much sense to me.
Yeah, we're working with our design group right now, so they've got sort of workflows and wireframes. So it's really happening, and I'm excited about that because we see then, more and more our folks are becoming more mobile, and we see that as a vehicle to do other tasks, maybe when you're home or traveling and things like that. So not only from the sponsor side, but also from the site side, a PI signing off on data. I know that that's the last thing that they really want to do because they look at that data and they oversee the patient safety and compliance, in a multitude of ways. So making that easier, maybe through an app, is also something that we're looking at. But let's walk before we can run. And that's the initial use case around that: bedside data entry and home health nurse visits.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. And, you talked a little bit about EHR to EDC, or we've talked about that before, at least. I mean, that one's interesting to me. I mean, do you see the EHR being used as sort of the source for a majority of sites or a smaller group of sites? I mean, how prevalent is that practically? I mean, I know for us, we work with a lot of different providers who use different EDCs or different EMRs rather. So it's not really that practical for us to have 6 different ways to log a study visit, as to where a large academic institution doing oncology research might make perfect sense. What's the future of that look like? I mean, I know that's something that's becoming more popular.
Yeah, it is. Look, that's something that we as an industry have failed at for 12 plus years. I'm sure, well, I know that a lot of my colleagues have dusted off sort of presentations from 2014 around, hey, we're going to crack the EHR to EMR to EDC nut. And reality is we have not. And there's a multitude of reasons why that hasn't been, scalable. It just hasn't been scalable the way that they've looked at that. It's almost, they've tried to have no human involved and it just be a pure technology play. And the reality is, I don't think that that's feasible. And the results show that. We've not really made meaningful progress in that, as I say, for 12 plus years. So we looked at it a little differently in that we have put the tooling in the site's hands, and you'll see more on this year. And again, this is not an advertisement, just letting people know what we're doing in this space of letting the coordinator choose which data goes into the ECRF, but more of presenting that electronic data that they have in their systems to them within EDC. That takes the sort of mapping element of data from the EMR, EHR to the ECRF, which is one of the main reasons why it's failed. We've tried to do that, and it's not a one-to-one match. And sometimes you have to choose a specific value that was collected in that EMR that's applicable to the protocol. So
there's a lot of unstructured data.
Exactly. And even if we can't tap into that electronic record, putting a tool in the site's hands that can take almost like the ECRF with them into their electronic system. And then they can just click on that value. So rather than have sort of dual monitors, which a lot of the site users use today, we can actually just have Rave go with them into their EMR, EHR system and click on that value and it goes into the ECRF. On the flip side of that, of the organizations, when we can tap in an aggregate manner into their EMR, EHR and leverage, whether this may be sort of acronyms that people are familiar with, but FHIR and HL7 and even the CCDA, which are all sort of formats of data coming out of these systems. Some are, legislatively driven, and some are just organic from how we can transport data from one system to another. Tapping into those formats, presenting that data from their EMR within Rave, and then the coordinator choose the data. Again, it's human in the loop, which makes it, there's still an element of human error in that, but at least it reduces the transcription errors of flipping numbers, flipping decimal points or, incorrect decimal point placement, etc.
Well, I mean, regardless, I love what I'm hearing in terms of, it sounds like there's options, whether it be a eSource-like platform or it be an EHR connected to EDC, or whether it's still the sort of traditional, paper and then transcribing to EDC. I mean, those, again, for the accounting for all the different ways sites run and knowing that for better or worse, sites aren't going to standardize under one sort of flag, at least not at this point. That optionality exists for sites. I mean, I love that that's being considered.
Sorry, right. It's even down to the user level. If the user doesn't want to use it, that's fine. Just keep on doing what you're doing. But and we all know adoption rates within individuals varies. So it's all based on the user, which is different to how we've tried to tackle that problem in the past.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and not something I think we've seen widely considered, I guess, sadly. So, no, I mean, I respect that. I like it. Well, very cool. Wayne, where can people find you online?
Yeah, so feel free to email me. My email is wayne.walker@3ds.com. Or, I'm on LinkedIn. People can feel free to connect there. I'd love to get interaction from the listeners of this podcast, as well as, you go to Medidata.com. There's a feedback loop there and somewhere you can actually make contact with Medidata. And I'm more than happy for you to ask, hey, I want to speak to this guy, because I love the direct sort of interaction with anybody in clinical research, but even more so people that use our platform looking for feedback all the time.
All right. If you got problems with the Rave, you start yelling at Wayne. Right, you guys heard it here first.
Please don't. Please. We have a wonderful customer support group. Please, if you have those problems, but feel free to give the feedback to them as well.
Very cool, Wayne. I really appreciate you coming on. Anything before we sign off here?
No, I just thank you, Brad, for what you do with this podcast. I think it's a wonderful vehicle to get the sort of voice of the sites out there because we need more of it. So appreciate your work in this.
No, I appreciate it, man. All right, Wayne. Hopefully we'll get you back on before too long to do a live stream. I know we've talked about that. I think there's some really interesting, cool stuff we can do there. So I'm looking forward to that. Stay tuned for it. And otherwise, go Chiefs, and thanks for coming on, Wayne.
Thank you. Have a good day.
As always, thank you so much for listening to the Note to File podcast. We made it 80 episodes, so I really appreciate everyone out there who's taken the time to listen and give feedback. I'm truly grateful. Make sure to check out notetofilepodcast.com for previous episodes, as well as information about our guests. Also, make sure to check out our weekly live stream. It's Tuesdays at noon Eastern. And also check out saveoursites.com for upcoming conference for clinical research sites. Again, thanks, guys.